Greetings. I would like to welcome you to a series of 12 lectures on the history of 20th century ethics. My name is David Solomon. I'm a member of the philosophy department at the University of Notre Dame, where I've been teaching this material since 1968, although not quite all of it, since not all of it had happened by 1968. I'm also the director of the Notre Dame Center for Ethics and Culture, an academic center in which we're very interested in the topics that I'll be talking about over the next 12 lectures. I want to begin today by talking a little bit about what I'm going to be doing over the next 12 lectures, 6 hours of talk about 20th century ethics. And I want to, at the very beginning, tell you some of the things that I'm not going to be talking about. 20th century ethics is a very big field. It covers lots and lots of things of a social nature as well as an intellectual nature, philosophical and theological, European and American. I'm going to focus in these lectures on what I'll call, for lack of a better term, academic Anglophone ethics. That is the kind of ethics that's gone on at the major universities in the English-speaking world. And it's a tradition that has followed a single kind of thread for the last 100 years. In focusing on this part of ethics, I'm going to be leaving out a lot of things that are terrifically interesting, and I want to be upfront about that at the very beginning. There's an incredibly rich tradition of ethics that has taken place in the continental universities, the whole tradition associated with phenomenology and existentialism. And I will on occasion in these lectures refer to this tradition, but for the most part, I'm going to ignore it. There are lots of things in the English-speaking world and in the academic English-speaking world that I'm going to ignore. The pragmatist tradition, John Dewey, William James, Charles Saunders Peirce, which has been enormously influential in this country, has, for one reason or another, been sort of pushed to the sideline in 20th century ethics, and I'm not going to talk much about the pragmatists either, although toward the end of the lectures we will make some reference to them. For this particular audience, an audience for a course supported by an institution called the International Catholic University, many of you will be interested in one of the liveliest parts of 20th century ethics, the contemporary neo-Thomist tradition. Now again, I'm going to say very little about this tradition, although I will come back to it in my final lecture and say something about why I think it may provide us with a great hope for the future. Neo-Thomism, for whatever reason, has not been central to this narrow line of research and argumentation and debate and dialectic that's gone on in the leading research universities, in the leading secular research universities, I should say, in England and America since 1903. Now, there might be some debates about whether the story I'm telling, the story of Anglophone academic ethics that runs essentially from G.E. Moore, as I will argue, up to Alistair McIntyre and Bernard Williams, there might be some debate of whether this is the most interesting story that one could tell in contemporary ethics. And I don't want to argue that it is. I do want to argue, though, that it's a very interesting story. There are other lectures in the International Catholic University that will deal with other aspects of 20th century ethics. What we're going to be talking about is Anglophone, academic, moral philosophy that is, for the most part, of the sort that has come to be described in the 20th century as analytic moral philosophy. Now, these lectures are correlated, for those of you taking this course, with lots of other readings and materials on the website for the International Catholic University. I'm going, however, to try to make these lectures on video independent of that other material. We'll see how well I succeed at that. But first, just to give you a look at where we're going over the next 12 lectures, if you look at the screen, today I'm going to talk about sort of some introductory matters with regard to ethics, and also the 19th century background for 20th century ethics. In the second lecture, I will be looking at a very interesting man, G.E. Moore, who in many ways is the figure that gets everything started in the 20th century, and a school of moral philosophy that he was associated with that we've come to call intuitionism. In the third lecture, we will turn to a discussion of emotivism and non-cognitivism and its association especially with a very important and interesting philosopher, A.J. Ayer. In lecture 4, we will look at some critics of this emotivist, the emotivist movement in contemporary ethics, and especially 3 remarkable philosophers, Philippa Foot, Elizabeth Anscombe, and John Searle. In lecture 5, a sort of huge change in moral philosophy occurs about this time, and by this time we're up to the 1960s, and we will discuss what I will call the return to normative theory, and especially in connection with that, some of the work of John Rawls, which we will pick up in lecture 6. There are a number of important sort of developments in contemporary moral philosophy in the 1970s and 80s especially, which focus on redeveloping some of the ideas of 19th century utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, and we'll call this the new consequentialism. We'll talk about it in lecture 7. In lecture 8, we will discuss the rediscovery in the 20th century of the notion of virtue, and in lecture 9, we will focus that discussion especially on the work of my colleague, Alistair McIntyre. In lecture 10, we will look at a number of very interesting contemporary figures who have come to be called anti-theorists who react against much of this material we've been talking about in the previous 3 lectures. In lecture 11, we will pick up some themes which I will have shamefully neglected earlier about the applied ethics revolution, the entry of moral philosophy into lots of casuistical questions in contemporary academic discussions. I will suggest to you at that time that there's something very puzzling about the applied ethics revolution. And finally, we will conclude in our final lecture with some predictions about where ethics might be going and what kind of trouble we might be in. So that's what we're going to do. Let me begin today. I want to do 2 things in this lecture, though. First, make some very general remarks about what ethics is, and do this very briefly indeed, and then turn to some questions about the 19th century and why it was that both social and cultural developments in the 19th century and philosophical developments set the stage for this, I think, very exciting story I'm going to be telling about 20th century academic ethics. So, how should we think about ethics in general? Let's begin with this sort of textbook definition of what ethics is. It'll probably do as well as any other. I suggest here that ethics is rational reflection on human conduct with the aim of directing that conduct in appropriate ways. Now, I'd like you to think about a number of features of this definition. Ethics is rational reflection. It's a matter of kind of standing back from the ethical problems that we're interested in. And it's not just sort of preaching about ethics. It's an attempt to rationally reflect on them, to use the powers of human reason, to sort things out, to put a certain distance between ourselves and the particular ethical problems we might be discussing. Ethics begins, so the story goes, in ancient Greece with Socrates walking around the ancient city of Athens, asking people to sort of explain themselves with regard to their ethical views. What he asks them to do is to step back from the particular ethical or moral commitments they might be making and reflect on how these can be justified, how they can be explained, how they can be appropriated in an entire human life. So ethics is rational reflection. It of course focuses on human conduct. We're not so much interested in what computers or other higher animals might do, and it's reflection that aims at directing the conduct in appropriate ways. Ethics is not, and we'll see that this is an important feature of our whole discussion of ethics, ethics is not a purely theoretical discipline. Although it involves rational reflection, it also involves an engagement with practice.